In February 1986, an American tourist vanished from the cobblestone streets of Salvador's historic district. Her camera was found 3 days later in a trash bin near the port. The film inside had been exposed to light, deliberately. For 38 years, her disappearance remained unsolved. The case file gathered dust in a basement archive, marked inactive. But in 2024, a construction crew digging foundations for a new hotel in the Pelourinho district unearthed something that would shatter decades of carefully maintained silence. What they found would lead investigators to a man who had lived his entire life within walking distance of where she disappeared. A man whose name appeared nowhere in the original investigation. A man who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. This is the story of Jennifer Morrison, and the silence that protected her killer for a generation. Salvador, 1986. The city breathes with contradictions. Colonial grandeur crumbles beside modernist ambition. The Pelourinho, once the heart of Portuguese colonial power, now decays in tropical humidity. Paint peels from Baroque facades. Cobblestones crack beneath the weight of centuries. The neighborhood exists in a strange limbo, too historic to demolish, too poor to restore. By day, tourists wander the steep streets, cameras around their necks, guidebooks in hand. They photograph the pastel buildings, the ornate churches, the women in traditional Bahian dress. By night, the district empties. Locals know better than to linger after dark. The narrow alleys become corridors of shadow. The streetlights, when they work at all, cast pools of sickly yellow light that seem to deepen the darkness between them. Brazil in 1986 exists in its own kind of transition. The military dictatorship has ended, but democracy remains fragile, uncertain. The economy staggers under hyperinflation. The cruzado, the new currency, loses value by the week. Tourism offers one of the few sources of foreign currency, and Salvador, with its beaches and colonial architecture, attracts visitors despite the country's instability. Jennifer Morrison arrived in Salvador on February 12, 1986. She was 28 years old, a high school English teacher from Portland, Oregon. She had saved for 2 years for this trip, 3 weeks traveling through Brazil during her winter break. Rio first, then Salvador, with plans to continue north to Recife and Fortaleza. She traveled alone. Her friends back home had thought it brave, perhaps reckless. But Jennifer had always been independent, curious, drawn to places that felt authentic rather than packaged for tourists. She wanted to see Brazil beyond the postcard images. She wanted to understand it. She checked into the Hotel Colonial on February 12th, a modest place, clean but basic, on Rua do Carmo in the upper city. The owner, Dona Marisa, remembered her clearly decades later. She was polite, Dona Marisa would tell investigators in 2024. She spoke a little Portuguese, not much, but she tried. She asked about places tourists didn't usually go. She wanted to see the real Salvador. Jennifer spent her first 2 days exploring. She visited churches, wandered through markets, ate acarajé from street vendors. She took photographs constantly, a Nikon FM2, black body, loaded with Kodachrome 64. She kept a journal, writing detailed observations about everything she saw. The heat, the colors, the music that seemed to pour from every doorway, the poverty that existed alongside such beauty. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, she went to the Mercado Modelo in the afternoon. She bought a small wooden carving of a fishing boat, a gift for her father. She ate dinner alone at a restaurant near her hotel, Moqueca de Peixe, a local fish stew. The waiter remembered her because she asked him to write down the recipe. She left a generous tip. She returned to her hotel around 9 p.m. Dona Marisa saw her come in, exchange a few words about the heat, then climb the stairs to her room on the second floor. Room 7. A small space with a window overlooking the street, a ceiling fan that rattled but provided relief from the humidity, a narrow bed with clean sheets. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Morrison alive. The next morning, February 15th, Jennifer did not come down for breakfast. This was not unusual. Dona Marisa assumed she had slept late or gone out early. But when Jennifer failed to check out by noon, as she had indicated she would, Dona Marisa became concerned. She knocked on the door of room 7. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Silence. Using her master key, she opened the door. The room was empty. The bed had been slept in, the sheets rumpled but not torn. Jennifer's suitcase sat on the floor, still packed. Her clothes hung in the small closet. Her toiletries remained in the bathroom. Her passport lay in the drawer of the bedside table, along with her traveler's checks and most of her cash. What was missing? Jennifer herself. Her camera. The small day pack she carried everywhere. The journal she wrote in each evening. Donna Marisa called the police. They arrived 2 hours later. 2 officers in wrinkled uniforms, moving with the unhurried pace of men accustomed to disappointment. They looked around the room, asked a few questions, took notes in a small spiral notebook. One of them suggested Jennifer had probably met a man, gone off with him, would return in a day or two embarrassed. Donna Marisa insisted this was not that kind of situation. Jennifer was not that kind of woman. Something was wrong. The officers said they would file a report. They left. Donna Marisa stood in the doorway of room 7, looking at the abandoned belongings of a woman she barely knew, and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. The next 48 hours passed in a fog of bureaucratic indifference. Donna Marisa called the police station repeatedly. Each time she was told the report had been filed, someone would look into it. These things take time. She contacted the American consulate in Rio. They promised to send someone, but Salvador was far and the consular staff was limited. On February 17th, 3 days after Jennifer's disappearance, a street cleaner found her camera in a trash bin near the Mercado Modelo, about a 15-minute walk from her hotel. The camera body was intact, but the back had been opened, exposing the film to light. Deliberately ruined. The camera was turned over to police, who eventually returned it to Donna Marisa, who stored it in a box with Jennifer's other belongings. The journal was never found. The day pack was never found. Jennifer Morrison was never found. The investigation, such as it was, moved with glacial slowness. The lead detective, Chief Detective Carlos Mendez, was a career officer 2 years from retirement, overworked and underpaid, responsible for dozens of cases in a city where crime was routine and resources were scarce. He interviewed Donna Marisa. He interviewed the hotel staff, a maid, a handyman, a young man who worked the night desk. He interviewed the waiter who had served Jennifer her last meal. He put up a few flyers with Jennifer's description. American woman, 28 years old, brown hair, 5 feet 6 inches, last seen wearing a white sundress. No one came forward with information. Or rather, several people came forward with useless information. Someone claimed to have seen an American woman getting into a car near the port. Someone else said they saw a woman matching Jennifer's description on a bus heading north. Another person insisted they had seen her at the beach in Itapua, very much alive, with a Brazilian man. None of these sightings led anywhere. None could be verified. They were the usual noise that surrounds any missing person case. Well-meaning confusion, attention-seeking fabrication, the human tendency to see what we expect to see. Chief Detective Mendez pursued the most obvious angles. Had Jennifer been robbed? Possibly, but her money and passport remained in her room. Had she been kidnapped? There was no ransom demand. Had she simply decided to disappear, start a new life? Her belongings suggested otherwise. People who vanish voluntarily take their passports. The American consulate sent a representative, a young vice consul named Robert Hayes, who arrived in Salvador on February 20th. He met with Chief Detective Mendez, reviewed the case file, expressed concern about the lack of progress. He contacted Jennifer's family in Oregon, her parents, her younger brother. They were frantic, desperate for information, willing to offer a reward. Hayes arranged for the reward, $5,000, a substantial sum in 1986 Brazil, especially with inflation eroding the currency daily. Posters went up around the Pelourinho, around the port, in bus stations. The local newspapers ran stories. For a few days, Jennifer Morrison's disappearance became news. Then the attention faded. Other crimes occurred. Other crises demanded resources. The investigation continued, technically, but with diminishing energy. Chief Detective Mendez followed leads that went nowhere. He interviewed taxi drivers, hotel workers, street vendors. He checked hospitals, morgues. He contacted police in other cities, asking if any unidentified bodies had turned up. Nothing. Jennifer Morrison had simply vanished, as if the city had swallowed her whole. By March, the investigation had effectively stalled. By April, it was dormant. By the time Chief Detective Mendez retired in 1988, the case file had been transferred to a storage room in the basement of the police headquarters, one box among thousands, a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. Jennifer's parents never stopped searching. They hired private investigators. They returned to Salvador multiple times over the years, walking the same streets their daughter had walked, showing her photograph to anyone who would look, hoping for a miracle that never came. Her father died in 2003, her mother in 2011, both without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. The case became a ghost story among expatriates and long-term travelers in Brazil, the American woman who disappeared in Salvador in the 80s. Some versions claimed she had been murdered by a serial killer. Others suggested she had been caught up in drug trafficking. A few romantic souls insisted she had fallen in love and chosen to vanish. None of these stories were true. But in the absence of truth, stories fill the void. For 38 years the silence held. And then, in March 2024, the Earth gave up its secret. To understand what happened to Jennifer Morrison, you must first understand who she was. Not the victim, not the missing person, not the name on a cold case file, the woman. Jennifer Ann Morrison was born on August 3, 1957 in Portland, Oregon. She was the first child of Robert and Patricia Morrison, followed 3 years later by her brother David. Her father worked as an accountant for a timber company. Her mother taught piano lessons from their home in the Eastmoreland neighborhood. By all accounts, Jennifer's childhood was stable, comfortable, unremarkable in the best way. She excelled in school, particularly in English and history. She read voraciously, novels, biographies, travel writing. She kept journals from the age of 12, filling notebook after notebook with observations, thoughts, fragments of poetry. In high school, she was editor of the school newspaper. She played clarinet in the band. She was not the most popular student, but she was well liked, known for her kindness and her curiosity. Her teachers remembered her as thoughtful, articulate, someone who asked questions that went deeper than the surface. She attended the University of Oregon, majoring in English with a minor in Spanish. She studied abroad for a semester in Madrid, her first extended time outside the United States. The experience transformed her. She returned with a hunger to see more of the world, to understand cultures beyond her own. After graduation, she earned her teaching credential and took a position at Franklin High School in Portland, teaching sophomore and junior English. Her students liked her. She made literature feel relevant, connected books to their lives. She assigned Steinbeck and Morrison, Marquez and Allende. She encouraged them to write honestly, to find their own voices. But teaching, while fulfilling, was not enough. Jennifer wanted to travel, to experience the places she taught about. She lived frugally, saving money from each paycheck. She spent her summers traveling: Mexico, Guatemala, Peru. She learned Portuguese through evening classes and language tapes, preparing for a trip to Brazil she had been planning for years. Brazil fascinated her, the literature, the music, the history of a country so vast and complex. She read Jorge Amado novels set in Salvador. She listened to Gilberto Gil and Caetano Veloso. She studied the history of slavery, colonialism, the mixing of African, indigenous, and European cultures. She wanted to understand Brazil not as a tourist destination, but as a living, breathing reality. In December 1985, she finalized her plans. 3 weeks in Brazil: Rio, Salvador, Recife, Fortaleza. She would travel alone, stay in modest hotels, take local buses, eat street food. She wanted to immerse herself, to see beyond the tourist facade. Her friends worried. Brazil in 1986 was not the Brazil of today. Crime was high. Infrastructure was unreliable. A woman traveling alone faced risks. But Jennifer was not reckless. She was careful, prepared. She had traveled alone before. She spoke the language, at least enough to get by. She promised to call home regularly, to stay in touch. On February 10, 1986, she boarded a flight from Portland to Miami, then Miami to Rio de Janeiro. She carried a single suitcase, her camera, her journal, and a guidebook, with pages already dog-eared from planning. She spent 2 days in Rio, Copacabana, Ipanema, the Christ statue overlooking the city. She wrote in her journal about the beauty and the poverty existing side by side, about the energy of the city, about feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. On February 12th, she flew to Salvador. She checked into the Hotel Colonial. She began exploring the city that would become her grave. Salvador in 1986 was a city of layers, each one revealing a different truth. The tourist layer, beaches, colonial architecture, carnival, capoeira performances. The historical layer, the first capital of Brazil, the center of the slave trade, a city built on sugar and suffering. The contemporary layer, poverty, inequality, crime, a city struggling to define itself in a country emerging from dictatorship. The Pelourinho, where Jennifer spent most of her time, embodied these contradictions. The name itself means whipping post, a reference to the place where enslaved people were publicly punished. By the 1980s, the district had become one of the poorest areas of Salvador. The grand colonial buildings, once homes of wealthy merchants and plantation owners, had been subdivided into tenements. Families lived in single rooms. Plumbing was unreliable. Electricity was sporadic. Yet tourists still came, drawn by the architecture, the history, the sense of authenticity. They walked the steep streets with cameras, taking photographs of decay they found picturesque. They bought handicrafts from vendors. They ate in the few restaurants that catered to foreigners. Then they returned to their hotels in safer neighborhoods, leaving the Pelourinho to its residents. Jennifer was different. She did not just photograph the buildings, she talked to people. She sat in small bars practicing her Portuguese, asking questions about daily life. She was genuinely interested, genuinely respectful. Several people who encountered her in those first days remembered this, the American woman who listened. On February 13th, she spent the afternoon at the Igreja de San Francisco, the Baroque church famous for its gold-covered interior. She sat in a pew for nearly an hour, not praying but simply observing. The elderly women with their rosaries, the tourists with their cameras, the quality of light filtering through stained glass. She wrote in her journal that evening, "There is something about this city that feels both beautiful and haunted. The past is not past here. It lives in the stones, in the faces of people, in the music that drifts through the streets at night. I feel like I am seeing something true, something most tourists miss, but I also feel a sadness I cannot quite name." On February 14th, Valentine's Day, she walked down to the Cidade Baixa, the lower city near the port. She watched fishermen mending nets. She ate lunch at a simple restaurant, grilled fish with rice and beans. She bought the wooden boat carving for her father at the Mercado Modelo, haggling gently with the vendor, both of them laughing at her Portuguese. That evening she returned to the Pelourinho. She had dinner at Restaurante do Senac, a place recommended by her guidebook, the moqueca de peixe, the fish stew cooked in coconut milk and donde oil. She asked the waiter, a young man named Marcos, about the ingredients. He wrote them down for her on a napkin: tomatoes, onions, peppers, cilantro, lime. She folded the napkin carefully and put it in her journal. After dinner, she walked back to her hotel. It was not yet dark, but the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The streets were not empty, but they were quieter than during the day. A few locals sat on stoops. Music played from open windows. The smell of cooking drifted on the humid air. She passed the Igreja do Rosário dos Pretos, the church built by enslaved Africans. She paused to look at it, the simple facade so different from the Baroque grandeur of other churches. She did not go inside. She continued walking. Somewhere in those final blocks between the church and her hotel, something happened. Someone saw her. Someone followed her. Someone made a decision that would end her life and haunt a city for decades. She reached the Hotel Colonial around 9 p.m. Donna Marisa saw her come in, asked how her day had been. Jennifer smiled, said it had been wonderful, that Salvador was everything she had hoped. She climbed the stairs to room 7. She unlocked the door. She went inside. And then, at some point in the hours that followed, she left again, or someone came for her. The exact sequence of events would remain unclear for 38 years. But what is certain is this: Jennifer Morrison never saw another sunrise. The investigation in 1986 focused on the obvious questions: who saw her last? Where did she go? Who might have wanted to harm her? But the investigation missed the most important question: who was watching her? Chief Detective Mendez interviewed dozens of people in the weeks following Jennifer's disappearance: hotel staff, restaurant workers, vendors, taxi drivers. He compiled a list of everyone who had interacted with her, everyone who might have information. But investigations are only as good as the questions asked, and in 1986, certain questions were never asked. Certain people were never interviewed. Certain connections were never made. The Pelourinho in 1986 was a tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers were noticed. A foreign woman traveling alone was definitely noticed. But being noticed and being remembered are different things. And being remembered and being willing to talk to police are different things still. In poor communities, in communities with complicated relationships with authority, people learn to see without seeing, to know without knowing. They learn that talking to police can bring trouble. They learn that silence is often safer than truth. So when Chief Detective Mendez asked his questions, people answered carefully. They said they had seen the American woman, yes. They said she seemed nice. They said they did not know anything about her disappearance. And mostly they were telling the truth. They did not know, but some people knew more than they said. Some people had seen things they chose not to mention. Some people had suspicions they kept to themselves. One of those people was a woman named Conceição Santos. She lived in a small house on Rua das Laranjeiras, one of the steep streets that wind through the Pelourinho. She was 62 years old in 1986, a widow who supported herself by taking in laundry and sewing. She had lived in the neighborhood her entire life. She knew everyone. Everyone knew her. On the evening of February 14th, Conceição was sitting on her front step, enjoying the slightly cooler air after sunset. She saw Jennifer Morrison walk past, heading toward the Hotel Colonial. She noticed her because foreign tourists were less common in the evening, and because the woman walked with purpose, not the wandering pace of someone sightseeing. But Conceição noticed something else. A man walking perhaps 20 meters behind Jennifer, not obviously following but moving in the same direction, maintaining the same distance. Conceição recognized him, Osvaldo Ferreira, a man who lived a few streets away. A quiet man, unmarried, who worked odd jobs, who kept to himself. There was nothing inherently suspicious about this. Osvaldo lived in the neighborhood. He had every right to walk the streets. But something about the way he moved, the way he watched Jennifer without seeming to watch her, made Conceição uneasy. She almost said something when the police came asking questions. But what would she say? That she saw a local man walking on his own street? That she had a feeling, nothing more? In a community where people were already wary of police, where being labeled an informant could make you a pariah, Conceição chose silence. She was not the only one. A vendor named João, who sold coconut water near the Mercado Modelo, had seen Osvaldo hanging around the market on February 14th, watching tourists, particularly watching women. But João did not mention this to police. What was there to mention? Osvaldo was always around. He was odd, yes, but odd was not criminal. A teenager named Lucas, who ran errands for various businesses in the Pelourinho, had seen Osvaldo talking to himself sometimes, muttering as he walked. But Lucas was not interviewed by police. He was just a kid. No one asked him what he had seen. These fragments of observation, these small unease, never coalesced into evidence. They remained scattered, disconnected, lost in the noise of daily life. And Osvaldo Ferreira, the quiet man who lived on Rua do Paço, continued his life undisturbed, carrying a secret that would remain buried for 38 years. The night of February 14th, 1986, was warm and humid, typical for Salvador in summer. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees Celsius even after sunset. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture from the ocean. In the Pelourinho, windows stayed open, hoping for a breeze that rarely came. Jennifer Morrison entered the Hotel Colonial, at approximately 9 p.m. Donna Marisa, sitting behind the small reception desk, greeted her. They exchanged a few words. Jennifer mentioned the heat. Donna Marisa agreed, said it would rain soon, it always did this time of year. Jennifer smiled, said goodnight, climbed the wooden stairs to the second floor. Room 7 was at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was painted blue, the paint chipped and faded. Jennifer unlocked it with the heavy brass key Donna Marisa had given her at check-in. She went inside, closed the door behind her. The room was small but clean. A single bed with a thin mattress and white sheets, a wooden chair, a small table with a lamp, a ceiling fan that rattled but provided some relief, a window overlooking Rua do Carmo, the shutters open to catch any breeze. Jennifer set down her day pack. She took off her sandals. She went to the small bathroom, washed her face, brushed her teeth. She changed into a cotton nightgown. She sat on the bed and opened her journal. She wrote for perhaps 20 minutes. The entry for February 14th described her day: the market, the wooden boat, the dinner, the walk back through streets growing dark. She wrote about the feeling of being in a place so different from home, about the strange mix of comfort and unease she felt. She wrote, "I love this city, but I also feel watched here. Not threatened exactly, just seen. As if the city itself is paying attention." She closed the journal. She set it on the bedside table next to her camera. She turned off the lamp. She lay down, the ceiling fan creaking above her, the sounds of the city drifting through the open window. Distant music, voices, the occasional car passing. She fell asleep. And at some point in the hours that followed, something happened that would end her life. The exact sequence of events remains, even now, partially unclear. But based on evidence discovered in 2024, investigators have reconstructed the most likely scenario. Sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. on February 15th, Jennifer woke to a sound. A knock at the door, perhaps, or a voice calling from the hallway. Or perhaps she woke to find someone already in her room, having entered through the window that faced the street, a window accessible from the narrow ledge that ran along the building's facade. What is certain is that Jennifer left room 7 that night. Whether she left voluntarily, believing she was going somewhere safe, or whether she was forced, threatened, coerced, is unknown. But she left. She took her camera, her journal, her small day pack. She left behind her suitcase, her passport, her money. This suggests she believed she would return, or that she was made to believe she would return. She left the hotel without being seen. Donna Marisa, who slept in a small room behind the reception desk, heard nothing. The night clerk, a young man named Paulo, who worked from midnight to 6 a.m., was not at his post. He had stepped out to buy cigarettes from a corner store, a routine he followed most nights. The hotel was unattended for perhaps 15 minutes. In that window, Jennifer disappeared. She was seen one more time. A taxi driver named Reynaldo Silva, who worked the night shift, saw a woman matching Jennifer's description walking on Rua do Pacho around 1:30 a.m. She was not alone. She was with a man, walking close beside her, his hand on her arm. Not violently but firmly, guiding her. Reynaldo noticed them because it was unusual to see a foreign woman in the Pelourinho at that hour. He slowed his taxi, considered asking if she needed help. But the man looked at him, a hard stare, and Reynaldo drove on. He was tired. It was late. He had learned not to involve himself in situations that were not his business. He did not report this sighting to police in 1986. He did not connect it to the missing American woman until much later, when investigators re-interviewed him in 2024. By then he was 78 years old, retired, his memory imperfect but certain about what he had seen. A foreign woman, a local man, 1:30 in the morning, Rua do Pacho. Rua do Pacho was a narrow street that ran parallel to Rua do Carmo, 1 block over. It was less traveled, darker, lined with buildings in various states of decay. At number 43 Rua do Pacho, in a building that had once been a colonial townhouse, but had long since been divided into small apartments, lived Osvaldo Ferreira. Osvaldo Ferreira was 41 years old in 1986. He had been born in Salvador, in the Pelourinho, in a small room in a building that no longer existed. His mother had been a domestic worker. His father was unknown, one of many men his mother had known briefly and never seen again. Osvaldo's childhood was marked by poverty and neglect. His mother worked long hours, leaving him alone for days at a time. He attended school sporadically, never learning to read well. He was a quiet child, withdrawn, the kind of boy other children ignored or mocked. He had few friends, no close relationships. As an adult, he worked odd jobs, carrying bags at the market, cleaning, minor repairs. He lived alone in a small apartment on Rua do Pacho, a single room with a shared bathroom down the hall. He had no family, no social circle. He was known in the neighborhood as a loner, strange but harmless. People saw him walking the streets at odd hours, muttering to himself, watching people with an intensity that made some uncomfortable. But being odd is not a crime. And in a neighborhood where everyone struggled, where poverty and hardship were common, Osvaldo was just another marginal figure, someone people noticed but did not think much about. What no one knew was that Osvaldo had been watching Jennifer Morrison since the day she arrived. He had seen her at the market, at the church, walking the streets with her camera. He had become fixated on her, her foreignness, her confidence, the way she moved through the city as if she belonged. He began following her, not obviously, but carefully, maintaining distance, learning her routines. He saw where she stayed. He learned her patterns. He watched her from doorways, from corners, from the shadows that the Pelourinho provided in abundance. On the evening of February 14th, he followed her back to the Hotel Colonial. He watched her go inside. He waited. He knew the night clerk's habits, knew there would be a window of time when the hotel was unattended. He had been planning this for days, perhaps without fully admitting to himself what he intended to do. Around 1 a.m. he entered the hotel through the front door, which was never locked. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. He went to room 7. He knocked softly. When Jennifer opened the door, confused, half asleep, he told her something. What he said, we will never know. But it was convincing enough that she followed him. Perhaps he claimed there was an emergency. Perhaps he said someone needed help. Perhaps he simply pushed his way in and threatened her. But she left with him, taking her camera and journal, believing or hoping she would return. He led her through the dark streets to his apartment on Rua do Pacho. And there, in that small room, he killed her. The details of Jennifer's death are difficult to recount. They are based on forensic evidence discovered 38 years later, evidence that tells a story of violence and terror. Jennifer was strangled. The hyoid bone in her throat was fractured, a clear indication of manual strangulation. She fought. Her fingernails contained traces of skin cells that would later be matched to Osvaldo Ferreira. She scratched him, tried to defend herself. But she was smaller, weaker, and he was determined. After she was dead, Osvaldo panicked. He had not planned beyond the act itself. He had a body in his apartment, a foreign woman whose disappearance would be noticed. He needed to hide her. He needed to make her vanish. His apartment had a small storage area, a closet-like space built into the wall. He wrapped Jennifer's body in a sheet and placed it there, behind boxes and old furniture. He cleaned the room as best he could, scrubbing blood from the floor, washing his hands over and over. The next day, February 15th, he took Jennifer's camera and threw it in a trash bin near the Mercado Modelo, but not before opening the back and exposing the film. He could not risk anyone developing those photographs, seeing images that might lead back to him. He burned her journal page by page in a metal can in the alley behind his building. He kept her daypack, hiding it in the storage space with her body. Then he went about his life. He worked his odd jobs, he walked the streets. He listened to people talk about the missing American woman. He heard about the police investigation, the interviews, the reward, and he said nothing. He was invisible, as he had always been. No one suspected him. No one even thought to ask. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The smell from the storage space became noticeable, but Osvaldo lived alone and the building was old, full of smells. He told neighbors a rat had died in the walls. Eventually the smell faded as Jennifer's body decomposed in the tropical heat. Years passed. The building on Rua do Pacho continued to decay. Osvaldo continued to live there alone, carrying his secret. He never spoke of what he had done. He never confessed. never showed remorse. He simply continued existing, a ghost among ghosts in a neighborhood full of them. In 1994, the building was condemned. Residents were evicted. Osvaldo moved to another apartment a few streets away. Before he left, he returned to the storage space. Jennifer's remains were now skeletal, desiccated. He wrapped them in plastic bags and carried them in the middle of the night to a construction site in the Pelourinho, where a new building was being erected. He buried her bones in the foundation trench, covering them with dirt and debris. Within days, concrete was poured. Jennifer Morrison became part of the structure of the city that had killed her, entombed in the foundation of a building that would stand for decades. And there she remained, silent and forgotten, while Osvaldo Ferreira lived on, growing older, more isolated, but never caught, never punished, never held accountable for what he had done. The investigation into Jennifer Morrison's disappearance in 1986 was by any measure inadequate. But to understand why requires understanding the context: a police force overwhelmed by crime, a city struggling with poverty and violence, a country in economic and political transition, and a case involving a foreign tourist in a neighborhood where cooperation with authorities was minimal. Chief Detective Carlos Mendez was not a bad detective. He was simply an exhausted one. In February 1986, he was responsible for investigating dozens of active cases: robberies, assaults, homicides, disappearances. Salvador's crime rate was high, resources were limited, and the bureaucracy was suffocating. A missing tourist, while concerning, was one case among many. The initial investigation followed standard procedures. Mendez interviewed hotel staff, reviewed Jennifer's belongings, contacted the American consulate, circulated her description. He assigned 2 officers to canvass the Pelourinho, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual on the night of February 14th or the morning of February 15th. The officers knocked on doors, showed Jennifer's photograph, asked questions. Most people said they had seen nothing. Some said they had seen the American woman during the day, but not at night. A few offered vague recollections that led nowhere. Maybe she got in a car. Maybe she was at the bus station. Maybe she went to the beach. No one mentioned Osvaldo Ferreira. Not because they were protecting him, but because he simply did not register as significant. He was part of the neighborhood's background, like the crumbling buildings and the stray dogs, invisible. The officers did not knock on the door of apartment 3 at 43 Rua do Pacho. There was no reason to. Osvaldo was not on any list of known criminals. He had no record of violence. He was nobody. This was the investigation's fundamental failure. It looked for the obvious. A robbery gone wrong, a kidnapping, a crime committed by someone already known to police. It did not look for the invisible man, the one who had never been noticed before. Chief Detective Mendez pursued several theories. The first was robbery. Jennifer had been carrying a camera, an expensive piece of equipment by Brazilian standards, in 1986. Perhaps someone had followed her, intending to steal it, and the situation had escalated. But this theory had problems. Her money and passport remained in her room, and the camera, when found, had been deliberately destroyed rather than sold. The second theory was kidnapping. Perhaps Jennifer had been taken for ransom, but no demand ever came. The American consulate waited, Jennifer's family waited, but no one contacted them asking for money. The third theory was that Jennifer had met someone, a romantic encounter that had gone wrong. Perhaps she had left the hotel voluntarily to meet a man, and something had happened. Mendez investigated this angle, asking if anyone had seen Jennifer with a man, if she had mentioned meeting anyone. But there was no evidence of this. Jennifer had been traveling alone, had not mentioned any romantic interest to Donna Marisa or anyone else. The fourth theory, whispered but not officially pursued, was that Jennifer had simply decided to disappear, that she had staged her own vanishing, started a new life somewhere in Brazil. This theory was popular among those who did not want to believe something terrible had happened, but it made no sense. Why leave her passport? Why leave her money? Why destroy her camera? Mendez also considered the possibility that Jennifer had been the victim of a serial offender. He reviewed unsolved cases involving missing women in Salvador and surrounding areas. He found several, but none with a clear pattern that matched Jennifer's disappearance. Most involved local women, sex workers, or women from poor neighborhoods. Jennifer was an outlier, a foreign tourist, educated, middle class. By March 1986, the investigation had reached an impasse. Every lead had been followed to a dead end. Every theory had problems. Mendez continued working the case, but with decreasing intensity. Other cases demanded attention. Resources were finite. The pressure from the American consulate was persistent, but not overwhelming. Brazil in 1986 had bigger problems than one missing tourist. The reward money offered by Jennifer's family generated some activity. People came forward claiming to have information, hoping for the $5,000. But every tip proved worthless. Mistaken identities, fabricated stories, well-meaning confusion. The reward remained unclaimed. Robert Hayes, the vice consul who had come to Salvador to assist with the case, stayed for 2 weeks. He met repeatedly with Chief Detective Mendez, reviewed the investigation, tried to apply pressure for more resources. But he was a diplomat, not a detective, and his power was limited. He could request, suggest, encourage, but he could not command. He met with Jennifer's parents when they arrived in Salvador in early March. Robert and Patricia Morrison were devastated, desperate, clinging to hope that was fading daily. Hayes accompanied them as they retraced Jennifer's steps, visited the places she had been, talked to people she had encountered. Patricia Morrison spoke to Donna Marisa, sitting in the small lobby of the Hotel Colonial, both women crying. Donna Marisa showed her room 7, still holding Jennifer's belongings. Patricia touched her daughter's clothes, her toiletries, the books she had been reading. She opened the journal Jennifer had left behind, reading entries that described a woman excited about her adventure, unaware of the danger approaching. Robert Morrison met with Chief Detective Mendez, asking hard questions about the investigation. Why had more officers not been assigned? Why was the search not more extensive? Why were there so few leads? Mendez answered patiently, explaining the limitations, the challenges, the reality of police work in Salvador. Robert Morrison listened, frustrated, helpless, understanding intellectually but unable to accept emotionally that his daughter might never be found. The Morrisons stayed in Salvador for 10 days. They put up more posters. They offered a higher reward, $10,000. They gave interviews to local newspapers and television stations, pleading for information. Patricia Morrison appeared on a popular evening news program, holding a photograph of Jennifer, asking anyone who knew anything to come forward. The response was sympathetic but unproductive. People expressed sorrow, outrage, concern. But no one had information that helped. The Morrisons returned to Oregon, broken, carrying Jennifer's belongings in her suitcase, leaving behind a daughter they would never see again. Hayes returned to Rio, promising to keep pressure on the investigation. He filed reports with the State Department, kept the case active in consular records. But as weeks turned to months, even his attention shifted to other matters. There were other Americans in trouble in Brazil, other crises requiring intervention. By mid-1986, the investigation had effectively ended. Officially, the case remained open. Mendez kept the file on his desk, occasionally reviewing it, hoping for a break that never came. But no new leads emerged. No new witnesses came forward. Jennifer Morrison had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. In 1988, Chief Detective Mendez retired. The case file was transferred to his successor, a younger detective named Augusto Lima. Lima reviewed it, saw the dead ends, the lack of evidence, the cold trail. He made a few perfunctory inquiries, then moved the file to the archive. There were current cases to solve. A 2-year-old missing person case with no leads was not a priority. The file went into a cardboard box, which went into a storage room in the basement of the police headquarters on Avenida 7 de Setembro. The box was labeled Casos No Resolvidos, 1986, Unsolved Cases, 1986. It sat on a metal shelf alongside hundreds of other boxes, gathering dust forgotten. Jennifer's camera remained in the evidence room for several years, then was returned to her family in 1990. Her other belongings and clothes, books, toiletries were eventually disposed of. The Hotel Colonial kept them for a year, then donated them to charity. Only the case file remained, a thin folder of reports and photographs, a bureaucratic ghost. In Oregon, Jennifer's family continued searching. Robert Morrison hired private investigators, 3 different ones over the years. Each came to Salvador, reviewed the case, conducted their own inquiries, and reached the same conclusion. Without new evidence, without witnesses, without a body, there was nothing to investigate. Jennifer had disappeared into a void. The private investigators offered theories. One suggested Jennifer had been killed by someone involved in drug trafficking, her body disposed of at sea. Another thought she might have been the victim of a transient criminal, someone passing through Salvador, who had since moved on or died. A third believed she had been buried somewhere in the city, her grave unmarked and unknown. None of these theories could be proven. They were speculation, attempts to impose narrative on mystery. The truth remained hidden, locked in the mind of one man who had never been suspected, never been questioned, never been considered. Over the years, the case occasionally resurfaced. In 1995, a journalist writing about unsolved crimes in Salvador included Jennifer's disappearance in an article. The piece generated some renewed interest. A few tips that went nowhere, then faded again. In 2003, when Robert Morrison died, his obituary mentioned his daughter Jennifer, who had disappeared in Brazil in 1986. Though a few people who had worked on the case saw the obituary and remembered, Chief Detective Mendez, by then long retired, read it and felt a familiar frustration. He had never solved that case. It had haunted him through his retirement. In 2011, when Patricia Morrison died, her obituary also mentioned Jennifer. By then, most people who remembered the case had retired, moved away, or died. The institutional memory had faded. New generations of police officers in Salvador had never heard of Jennifer Morrison. The case became a footnote, a story told occasionally among expatriates and travelers, the American woman who vanished in Salvador in the 80s. Some people claimed to know what had happened, offering theories based on nothing but imagination. Others insisted the case would never be solved, that too much time had passed, that the truth had died with whoever was responsible. And in a small apartment in the Pelourinho, Osvaldo Ferreira continued his life. He was older now, in his 60s, still working odd jobs, still living alone. He had moved several times over the years, always staying in the same neighborhood, the only place he knew. He was a fixture, an old man people saw but did not notice, invisible as he had always been. He never spoke of Jennifer Morrison. He never returned to the building where he had killed her. He never visited the construction site where he had buried her bones. He simply continued existing, day after day, year after year, carrying his secret like a stone in his chest. And Jennifer remained where he had left her, entombed in concrete, part of the foundation of a building in the heart of the Pelourinho, silent and forgotten, waiting for the earth to give up its secret. Time has a way of eroding everything: stone, memory, justice. In the years following Jennifer Morrison's disappearance, the case did not so much go cold as it simply dissolved into the past, becoming less real with each passing year. By the 1990s, Salvador was changing. The Pelourinho, long neglected, became the focus of a massive restoration project. The Brazilian government, recognizing the district's historical significance, invested millions in renovation. Buildings were restored to their colonial grandeur. Streets were repaved. Residents were relocated, often forcibly, to make way for tourist-friendly businesses, restaurants, shops, museums. The transformation was controversial. Locals who had lived in the Pelourinho for generations were pushed out, their homes converted into boutique hotels and art galleries. The neighborhood became cleaner, safer, more picturesque. But it also became less authentic, a stage set of colonial Brazil rather than a living community. The building at 43 Rua do Pacho was demolished in 1996 as part of the renovation. Osvaldo Ferreira, who had moved years earlier, watched from a distance as the structure came down, reduced to rubble in a matter of days. If he felt anything, relief, fear, nostalgia, he showed no sign. He simply watched, then walked away. The site remained empty for several years, a gap in the streetscape filled with weeds and trash. Eventually, in 2001, a new building was constructed. A small hotel catering to tourists painted yellow and white, with air conditioning and Wi-Fi, and a rooftop terrace overlooking the bay. No one knew that Jennifer Morrison had spent her final moments in the building that had stood there before. No one knew that her blood had soaked into the floorboards, that her screams had echoed in that small room. The past was buried beneath fresh paint and new construction, invisible. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology offered new hope for cold cases around the world. DNA analysis, digital databases, improved investigative techniques. These tools allowed police to revisit unsolved crimes to find answers that had been impossible decades earlier. In 2005, the Salvador Police Department received funding to digitize old case files and review cold cases using modern methods. A team of detectives was assigned to go through archived files, identifying cases that might benefit from new technology. Jennifer Morrison's case was among those reviewed. A detective named Mariana Costa pulled the file, read through the reports, examined the evidence list. There was not much to work with. Photographs, witness statements, a few personal items. No biological evidence had been preserved. No DNA samples existed. The camera, returned to the family, was long gone. Costa made some inquiries. She contacted the American consulate, asking if the family was still interested in pursuing the case. She learned that both of Jennifer's parents had died, but her brother, David Morrison, was still alive, living in Seattle. She called him. David Morrison was 52 years old, a software engineer, married with 2 children. He had been 25 when his sister disappeared, a young man just starting his career. Her disappearance had shaped his life in ways he was still discovering. He had never stopped wondering what happened to her. When Detective Costa called, explaining that the case was being reviewed, David felt a surge of hope he had not allowed himself in years. He asked what new evidence existed. Costa had to tell him the truth. There was no new evidence. The review was simply a formality, a way of ensuring nothing had been missed. But without physical evidence, without witnesses, there was little that could be done. David asked if he could come to Salvador, if he could see the case file, if there was anything he could do to help. Costa said he was welcome to come, but she cautioned him not to expect a breakthrough. Too much time had passed. The trail was not just cold, it had evaporated. David came anyway. He flew to Salvador in 2006, 20 years after his sister's disappearance. He met with Detective Costa, reviewed the case file, visited the places Jennifer had been. The city had changed dramatically. The Pelourinho was unrecognizable, transformed from the decaying neighborhood his sister had explored into a polished tourist attraction. He stood outside the Hotel Colonial, which was still operating though under new ownership. He walked the streets Jennifer had walked, trying to feel some connection to her, some sense of her presence. But there was nothing. She was gone, erased by time and change. David Morrison returned to Seattle with no answers, only a deeper understanding of how completely his sister had vanished. He tried to accept that he would never know what happened to her, that some mysteries remain unsolved, that closure is not always possible, but he could not let go entirely. He created a website dedicated to Jennifer's case, posting photographs, timeline, details of the investigation. He hoped someone, somewhere, might see it and remember something, might have information they had never shared. The website received occasional visitors, mostly true crime enthusiasts, but no useful leads. In 2010, David submitted Jennifer's case to several cold case organizations and television programs that specialized in unsolved disappearances. Most declined, saying the case was too old, too international, too lacking in evidence. One program expressed interest but ultimately decided against it when they realized there was no footage, no interviews, nothing visual to work with. David also contacted forensic genealogy companies, hoping that if Jennifer's body was ever found, DNA technology might help identify her. He submitted his own DNA to databases, creating a reference point. But without a body, without remains, the DNA was useless. By 2015, David had exhausted every avenue he could think of. He continued maintaining the website, continued hoping, but he had accepted the likelihood that his sister's fate would remain unknown. He focused on his own family, his own life, carrying Jennifer's memory, but no longer consumed by the search. In Salvador, Detective Costa moved on to other cases. Jennifer Morrison's file went back into the archive, now digitized but still unsolved. The case was officially cold, inactive, unlikely ever to be resolved. Osvaldo Ferreira by the 2010s was an old man. He was in his 70s, his health declining, his body worn by years of poverty and hard living. He still lived in the Pelourinho, though the neighborhood barely resembled the place he had known in his youth. He worked occasionally, small jobs that required little skill, sweeping sidewalks, carrying bags, watching parked cars. He lived in a tiny apartment on Rua Gregorio de Matos, a single room with a shared bathroom, much like the place where he had killed Jennifer Morrison decades earlier. He was alone. He had always been alone. He had no friends, no family, no connections to anyone. He was a ghost, a marginal figure in a neighborhood that had been gentrified around him, one of the few remaining residents from the old Pelourinho. People who encountered him found him strange, unsettling. He muttered to himself, had conversations with people who were not there. Some thought he was mentally ill. Others thought he was just old, his mind deteriorating. No one suspected he was a murderer. He never spoke of Jennifer Morrison, but sometimes, late at night, alone in his room, he thought about her. Not with remorse, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if remembering something that had happened to someone else. He remembered her face, her voice, the way she had looked at him in those final moments, confused and terrified. He wondered sometimes if anyone would ever find out what he had done. He wondered if he would die with his secret, if it would die with him. He felt no urge to confess, no need for absolution. He simply wondered, in the abstract way one wonders about things that cannot be changed. And Jennifer remained where he had buried her, in the foundation of a building that had been constructed on the site of the old construction project, her bones mixed with concrete and rebar, hidden in plain sight in the heart of the city that had killed her. In March 2024, 38 years after Jennifer Morrison disappeared, a construction crew began excavation work in the Pelourinho. The project was ambitious, a new luxury hotel, 5 stories, designed to blend modern amenities with colonial aesthetics. The location was prime, Rua Juan de Deus, in the heart of the historic district, with views of the bay. The construction company, Construtora Bahia Moderna, had obtained all necessary permits. The site had been surveyed, the plans approved. On March 12, 2024, excavators began digging the foundation, removing layers of old concrete and compacted earth. On March 15th, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, an excavator operator named Jefferson Alves noticed something unusual in the dirt his machine had just turned over. Something white, partially buried. He stopped the excavator, climbed down, looked closer. It was bone, human bone, a skull, partially intact, staring up from the earth with empty sockets. Jefferson immediately called his supervisor, who called the site manager, who called the police. Within an hour, the construction site was cordoned off with yellow tape. Detectives arrived, along with forensic technicians and a medical examiner. The excavation was halted. The area was treated as a crime scene. Forensic anthropologists were called in to carefully excavate the remains, to preserve any evidence that might exist, after decades in the ground. Over the next 3 days, the team uncovered a complete skeleton, along with fragments of fabric, plastic bags, and several small objects, a metal zipper, buttons, a tarnished silver ring. The bones were carefully removed, documented, transported to the Instituto Medico Legal for analysis. The discovery made headlines in Salvador. Human remains found in the Pelourinho were not unprecedented. The district was old, built on layers of history. But these bones were relatively recent, not colonial era. The media speculated, a murder victim, a missing person, a forgotten grave. The investigation was assigned to Detective Rodrigo Tavares, a veteran investigator with the Departamento de Homicidios. Tavares was 53 years old, methodical, patient, known for his work on cold cases. He approached the investigation systematically. First, identification. The medical examiner determined the remains were female, approximately 25 to 30 years old at time of death, Caucasian. The bones showed signs of trauma, a fractured hyoid bone consistent with strangulation. Time of death was estimated at 25 to 40 years prior, based on decomposition and the materials found with the body. Second, missing persons. Tavares accessed the database of unsolved missing person cases in Salvador, going back 40 years. He was looking for a young white woman who had disappeared in the 1980s or 1990s. The list was long, but one name stood out. Jennifer Ann Morrison, American tourist, disappeared February 1986. Tavares pulled the old case file, now digitized. He read through Chief Detective Mendez's reports, the witness statements, the investigation timeline. He noted the location. Jennifer had been staying at the Hotel Colonial, had last been seen in the Pelourinho. The construction site where the remains were found was less than 300 meters from the hotel. Third, DNA. Tavares contacted the American consulate, explained the situation, asked if any family members of Jennifer Morrison were still alive and willing to provide DNA for comparison. The consulate contacted David Morrison in Seattle. David received the call on March 20, 2024. A detective in Salvador had found remains that might be his sister. They needed a DNA sample for comparison. David felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, dread, relief, grief. After 38 years, he might finally have an answer. He went to a local lab, provided a cheek swab, which was sent to Brazil via diplomatic courier. The sample arrived in Salvador on March 25th. The comparison analysis took 3 days. On March 28, 2024, the results came back. Positive match. The remains found at the construction site were Jennifer Morrison. The confirmation that the remains were Jennifer's transformed the investigation. This was no longer an unidentified body. This was a murder victim with a name, a history, a family. This was a case that had been unsolved for 38 years, and now there was a chance, however slim, of finding answers. Tavares assembled a team. He brought in forensic specialists, cold case experts, a forensic genealogist. He reviewed every detail of the original investigation, looking for leads that had been missed, connections that had not been made. He also went public. On April 2, 2024, the Salvador police held a press conference announcing that the remains of Jennifer Morrison had been found, that her death was being investigated as a homicide, and that they were seeking any information from the public. The press conference was covered extensively. The story had everything: a cold case, an American tourist, a mystery spanning decades. News outlets in Brazil and the United States ran stories. Jennifer's photograph, the same one her parents had distributed in 1986, appeared on television and in newspapers once again. David Morrison flew to Salvador. He met with Detective Tavares, viewed the evidence, tried to process the reality that his sister's body had been found after all these years. He gave interviews, appealing for anyone with information to come forward. The publicity generated tips. The police hotline received dozens of calls. Most were useless. People claiming to have seen Jennifer in 1986, people offering theories, people seeking attention. But a few calls were more interesting. One came from Conceição Santos. She was now 100 years old, living in a nursing home, her memory fading but still sharp about certain things. She saw the news coverage and remembered something she had never told police in 1986. The man she had seen walking behind Jennifer Morrison on the evening of February 14th. Osvaldo Ferreira. Another call came from Reynaldo Silva, the taxi driver, now 78. He remembered seeing a foreign woman with a local man on Rua do Pacho in the early morning hours of February 15, 1986. He had never reported it at the time, had not connected it to the missing tourist. But seeing the news coverage brought the memory back. Detective Tavares now had something the original investigation had lacked: a name: Osvaldo Ferreira. He ran the name through police databases. Osvaldo had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing that would have flagged him in 1986. But he was real. He had lived in the Pelourinho, and 2 witnesses had placed him near Jennifer Morrison around the time of her disappearance. Tavares began searching for Osvaldo. He checked current address records, social services, hospital records. He found that Osvaldo was still alive, still living in Salvador, still in the Pelourinho. He was 79 years old, living in a small apartment on Rua Gregorio de Matos. On April 10, 2024, Tavares and 2 other detectives went to Osvaldo's apartment. They knocked on the door. An old man answered, thin, stooped, with yellowed eyes and trembling hands. Osvaldo Ferreira. Tavares identified himself, said they were investigating the death of an American woman in 1986, asked if Osvaldo would be willing to answer some questions. Osvaldo stared at him for a long moment, his face expressionless. Then he nodded, stepped aside, let them in. The apartment was tiny, cluttered, smelling of age and neglect. Osvaldo sat on the edge of his bed. The detectives stood, there being nowhere else to sit. Tavares asked Osvaldo if he remembered 1986, if he remembered an American woman who had disappeared from the Pelourinho. Osvaldo said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I remember." Tavares asked what he remembered. Osvaldo looked at him, and something in his eyes shifted. Not fear, not remorse, but a kind of resignation. He said, "I killed her." The confession came easily, almost casually, as if Osvaldo had been waiting 38 years to say the words aloud. He described following Jennifer, entering her hotel, convincing her to leave with him, taking her to his apartment, strangling her, hiding her body, eventually burying her bones at a construction site. He showed no emotion as he spoke. He did not cry, did not apologize, did not ask for forgiveness. He simply recounted the events as if describing something that had happened to someone else, something distant and unimportant. Tavares arrested him. Osvaldo did not resist. He was taken to the police station, formally charged with murder, placed in a holding cell. The news spread quickly. The killer of Jennifer Morrison had been found, had confessed, had been arrested after 38 years. The arrest shocked the community. Osvaldo had lived among them for decades, invisible, unremarkable. No one had suspected, no one had known. He had been hiding in plain sight, protected by his own insignificance. The arrest of Osvaldo Ferreira on April 10, 2024, brought an end to one of Salvador's longest-running mysteries, but it also raised difficult questions about justice, accountability, and the cost of silence. In the days following his arrest, Osvaldo was evaluated by psychiatrists and psychologists. They found him competent to stand trial, though his mental state was complex. He showed signs of schizoid personality disorder, a lifelong pattern of social isolation and emotional detachment. But he understood right from wrong. He knew what he had done. He simply did not care. In interviews with investigators, Osvaldo provided details that only the killer could know. He described the interior of Jennifer's hotel room, though he had never been questioned about it in 1986. He described the clothing she had been wearing, details that matched the fabric fragments found with her remains. He led police to the location of his old apartment building on Rua do Pacho, now demolished, and described exactly where he had killed her. He also explained why he had done it. His answer was chilling in its banality. He had wanted her. He had watched her, become obsessed with her, and decided to take her. There was no elaborate motive, no complex psychology, just desire and opportunity and a complete absence of empathy. When asked if he felt remorse, Osvaldo said no. When asked if he understood the pain he had caused, he said he supposed he did, intellectually, but it did not affect him. When asked why he had confessed so readily after hiding his crime for 38 years, he said he was tired. Tired of carrying the secret, tired of living, ready for it to be over. The legal proceedings moved quickly by Brazilian standards. Osvaldo's confession, combined with forensic evidence and witness testimony, made the case straightforward. His court-appointed attorney advised him to plead guilty, which he did at his arraignment on April 25, 2024. The trial was scheduled for July 2024. David Morrison flew to Salvador to attend, to finally see the man who had killed his sister face justice. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, local residents, and a few elderly people who remembered the case from 1986. Osvaldo sat in the defendant's chair looking small and frail, a 79-year-old man who seemed unlikely to harm anyone. But appearances deceive. The prosecutor presented the evidence: the forensic analysis of Jennifer's remains, the fractured hyoid bone indicating strangulation, the witness statements placing Osvaldo near Jennifer at the time of her disappearance, and most damning, his own detailed confession. The defense offered no real counter-argument. Osvaldo's attorney acknowledged his client's guilt, but asked for consideration of his age and mental state. He argued that Osvaldo had lived a life of poverty and isolation, that his crime, while terrible, was the act of a deeply damaged person. The prosecutor argued that Osvaldo had shown no remorse, had hidden his crime for nearly 4 decades, had allowed Jennifer's family to suffer without answers for an entire generation. He asked for the maximum sentence allowed under Brazilian law. David Morrison was given the opportunity to address the court. He stood, looked at Osvaldo, and spoke about his sister, about the vibrant, curious, kind woman she had been, about the hole her disappearance had left in his family, about his parents dying without knowing what happened to their daughter, about 38 years of wondering, hoping, grieving. He said he felt no satisfaction in seeing Osvaldo arrested. Justice delayed for nearly 4 decades was not really justice, but at least now he knew. At least now Jennifer could be laid to rest properly. At least now the silence had been broken. Osvaldo listened without expression. When asked if he had anything to say, he declined. He had nothing to add. On July 18, 2024, the judge delivered the verdict: guilty of murder. The sentence: 25 years in prison, the maximum for homicide under Brazilian law. Given Osvaldo's age, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison. Osvaldo showed no reaction. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, transferred to a prison facility outside Salvador. He would spend his remaining years in a cell, finally visible, finally held accountable, no longer invisible. For David Morrison, the verdict brought a complicated sense of closure. His sister's killer had been caught, tried, convicted. But it had taken 38 years. His parents had died without answers. Jennifer had spent nearly 4 decades buried in concrete, forgotten. The justice felt incomplete, inadequate, but it was something. After all the years of uncertainty, of wondering, of hoping against hope, he finally knew what had happened. He could finally grieve properly, could finally let go of the desperate search that had defined so much of his life. Jennifer's remains were released to David in August 2024. He had them cremated in Salvador, then transported back to the United States. On September 14, 2024, 38 years and 7 months after her disappearance, Jennifer Morrison was finally laid to rest in Portland, Oregon, in the same cemetery where her parents were buried. The funeral was small: David and his family, a few of Jennifer's old friends who had never forgotten her, a representative from the State Department. They spoke about Jennifer's love of travel, her curiosity about the world, her kindness. They mourned not just her death, but the life she never got to live. The students she never taught, the places she never saw, the family she never had. David placed a photograph on her grave. Jennifer in Salvador, taken on February 13, 1986, the day before she disappeared. She is standing in front of a colonial building, smiling, the tropical sun bright on her face. She looks happy, excited, alive. It is how he chooses to remember her. The case raised uncomfortable questions in Salvador. How had Osvaldo Ferreira lived among them for 38 years without being caught? Why had the original investigation failed so completely? What did it say about the city, about the police, about the value placed on certain lives? Detective Tavares, in interviews after the trial, was candid about the failures of 1986. The investigation had been inadequate, under-resourced, hampered by lack of cooperation and institutional limitations. Osvaldo had been invisible because no one was looking for someone like him. A nobody, a marginal figure, someone who did not fit the profile of a criminal. But Tavares also pointed out that the case had been solved eventually because people came forward. Conceição Santos, 100 years old, remembering something she had seen 38 years earlier. Reynaldo Silva, the taxi driver, finally reporting what he had witnessed, the construction workers who immediately called police when they found the bones, the forensic scientists who identified Jennifer's remains, the detectives who pursued every lead. Justice had been slow, but it had arrived. The silence had been broken. The invisible man had been made visible. The case also prompted a review of other cold cases in Salvador. Detective Tavares assembled a team to re-examine unsolved disappearances and murders from the 1980s and 1990s, using modern forensic techniques and renewed investigative efforts. Several cases were reopened. Some were solved. Others remained mysteries, but at least they were being looked at again. The victims remembered, their stories told. In the Pelourinho, the construction site where Jennifer's remains were found became briefly a place of pilgrimage. People left flowers, candles, notes. Someone painted a small mural on a nearby wall. Jennifer's face with the words, "No esquecida," not forgotten. The construction company, after consultation with David Morrison and local authorities, decided to create a small memorial at the site. A bronze plaque was installed reading, "In memory of Jennifer Ann Morrison, 1957-1986, American teacher and traveler whose life was taken in this place. May she rest in peace, and may her story remind us to see the invisible, to speak for the silent, and to never stop seeking truth." The luxury hotel was completed in early 2025. The memorial remains in the lobby, a quiet reminder of the tragedy that occurred on that ground decades earlier. David Morrison returned to Salvador one final time in October 2024 to see the memorial, to walk the streets his sister had walked, to say goodbye. The city had changed so much since 1986. The Pelourinho was beautiful now, restored, safe, full of tourists taking photographs. It was hard to imagine the dark, decaying neighborhood where Jennifer had disappeared. But standing in front of the memorial, David felt a sense of peace. His sister had not been forgotten. Her story had been told. Her killer had been caught. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending. And after 38 years of uncertainty, that meant something. Osvaldo Ferreira died in prison on January 3, 2025, less than 6 months after his conviction. He was 79 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though his health had been declining for months. He died alone as he had lived most of his life. There was no funeral, no mourners, no one to claim his body. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery, a nobody in death as he had been in life. The only difference was that now everyone knew what he had done. He was no longer invisible. He was infamous. The news of his death reached David Morrison through Detective Tavares. David felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no closure. Osvaldo's death changed nothing. Jennifer was still gone. The years were still lost. The pain was still there, but the story was over. The silence that had protected Osvaldo for 38 years had been broken. The truth had emerged, painful and terrible, but real. Jennifer Morrison's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy with a known perpetrator, a solved case, a closed chapter. In Portland, David visited his sister's grave. He told her that it was over, that the man who killed her was dead, that she could rest now. He did not know if she could hear him, did not know if it mattered, but he said it anyway because some things need to be said, even into silence. The case of Jennifer Morrison became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily someone can vanish, how long injustice can persist, how silence can protect the guilty. But it also became a story of persistence, a family that never stopped searching, detectives who never stopped investigating, witnesses who finally came forward, and a city that finally confronted an uncomfortable truth. In the years since, the case has been featured in true crime documentaries, podcasts, articles. Jennifer's story has been told and retold, each version emphasizing different aspects: the failure of the original investigation, the advances in forensic science that made identification possible, the confession that ended decades of mystery. But at the center of all these retellings is Jennifer herself, a 28-year-old woman who loved to travel, who wanted to understand the world, who was kind and curious and brave. A woman who deserved to live a full life, to return home from her adventure, to teach her students to grow old. A woman whose life was stolen by a man who saw her not as a person, but as an object, something to possess and destroy. Her death was a tragedy, but her story, finally told in full, is a testament to the importance of never giving up, never forgetting, never accepting that some truths are too buried to uncover. Jennifer Morrison was not forgotten. The silence was broken, and in the end, that matters. The Pelourinho continues its life, tourists walking its cobblestone streets, music drifting from open doorways, the sun setting over the bay in brilliant colors. The city moves forward as cities do, carrying its history in its stones and its stories. And in a quiet cemetery in Portland, Oregon, a grave marker reads, Jennifer Ann Morrison, August 3, 1957, February 15, 1986, teacher, traveler, beloved daughter, and sister gone but never forgotten. The silence has been broken. The truth has been told. Jennifer Morrison can finally rest in peace. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave your rating in the comments. From 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world has tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.